All right, and we are live. I'm just going to wait a moment or two. I see there are people watching right now. If we're coming in loud and clear, let us know in the chat. That would be great. I'm just waiting a moment or two for the video to pop up on YouTube, so I know that it is actually streaming and we're actually getting audio and all of those wonderful things. So I do hear us, but if you're watching in the chat, let us know that we're coming in loud and clear. So hello, everybody. My name's Jacquelyn, and welcome back to another episode of the IndieVerse. I believe we're on episode 23. It has been a while since we've had an episode. It has probably been about 2 months. It's been since the Christmas break, I suppose. And so really happy to be back. And today I'm here with Leslie, and I'm going to turn it over to Leslie in just a moment. But I see everybody in the chat saying that we're coming through loud and clear. For anybody who's watching these interviews or this interview or the IndieVerse for the first time, the way it works is I've got a bunch of questions for Leslie. Here on this channel, we interview indie authors, whether it be published through small presses or independently published, self-published, etc., and folks in that industry. So I've got a whole bunch of questions, and then we are going to jump into live audience questions. So if anybody watching has questions throughout, please drop them in the chat and we will get to those at the end. But right now, Leslie, I'm going to turn it over to you. To give a brief introduction of yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm Leslie Conzatti. I am the author of Princess of Undersea, which is a fairy tale retelling of the story of the Little Mermaid. And it kind of kicks off a whole series. I'm going to be writing a whole series of retellings. And so that's going to be really fun. I've also done several short stories in different anthologies. And I just really love fantasy and fairy tales and everything in between. And it's been, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, can I ask what other retellings you have in store, or is that like top secret information?
No, I'm so excited about it that I don't mind telling. It's really it's going to be really fun. So I'm working on the sequel right now, which I'm kind of taking inspiration from Pinocchio. Actually, I picked because
cool.
It's got a male main character, and there aren't a whole lot of fairy tales with male main characters, and I just felt like the aesthetic kind of fit the Pinocchio story and it's not like it was a character who was like an inanimate object and he wants to be like a real person or whatever kind of a thing. So that whole thing is not quite what it is, but like the whole journey that Pinocchio goes on, and like there's a carnival involved and he's got to escape the carnival and everything like that. So that's going to be really fun. And then book 3 is going to be a kind of a Wild West steampunk take on Aladdin.
Ooh.
That's going to be really fun. And then for the last book, I kind of figured out in this world that I've built originally for The Little Mermaid, I could actually do a rendition of Snow White with mermaids.
Oh, very cool.
That's going to be fun.
That's so fun. It's like a retellings, but also mashups of different genres and fairy creatures, or like fantasy creatures, I suppose I should say. Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. I'll get more into that later because I love retellings. I've never written one, but I love them. So the first question that I typically ask everybody that comes onto the show, even folks who maybe are not so much focused on the writing aspects of writing, of like the writer-verse, but everybody has an interest in it. And obviously you're a writer. So I guess my first question is, how did you get started in writing? And I like, what is your writer origin story? So just walk us through, it's so interesting to hear, right? Because some people have wanted to write forever, and then there's some folks who only fell into it a little bit later in life. So it's really interesting. I love hearing all about people's origin stories. So would love to hear yours.
Yes. Well, my origin actually starts right about the time that I learned to read, because I remember I remember going through this book, like, and not knowing what the text said. Like, I couldn't read any of the words, but I saw the pictures, and immediately I was drawn to sort of tell my own story and tell myself what was going on in the pictures.
Mhm.
And so then I kind of went through the whole book and everything like that. And so then a couple of years later, I thought I'd already read that book. And then I'm actually reading the words and I'm like, this is not what I'm remembering. And I realized that that's what I had done is I made up my own story kind of a thing based on the pictures that some parts of the story actually matched what happened in the story because the illustration was good, but like other parts were just like very different. And I was like, oh my goodness. But I had so much fun. I always had fun in the language arts classes all growing up. Just like anytime there was a creative writing prompt, I was like, I love this. Can I write more? Can I do more of it?
That's
So that's kind of where it started.
That's awesome. And just like that, I've read this before. Wait, no, I haven't. I actually wrote this before type thing. Um,
Yeah.
that's so interesting. And was there a point, after that initial kind of like writerly origin story, was
Mhm.
there a point where you were like, this is what, like, I want to do this professionally? I want to publish books? Was there another point, or was that just kind of always part of your journey?
Well, so it's kind of one of those things where it's like I enjoyed doing it. It was kind of a
Mm.
pastime and a
Mhm.
hobby. And then there's the quote, I think it was Maya Angelou or somebody said like write the stories that you want to read. And that kind of was my motivation from at the start was like these were stories that I wanted to read that I never like I couldn't find them on the library shelves, but it felt really cool it looked really cool in my head. So I wanted to put it on the paper so that I could have that experience of reading it kind of a thing and enjoying it that way. And so I just started writing the stories just for my own enjoyment. And then it wasn't until like I started studying more about like the mechanics of storytelling and going through like literature classes in like high school and college that I'm like I this is what I want to do. This is the goal is to be able to like write full time and just keep making stories for people to enjoy.
That's awesome. What a like that's so great. And just like I completely agree. Like I kind of I well I had a similar kind of journey to you where it was a little bit it was like a progressive realization, I should say,
Mhm.
that it was something that I wanted to do, I always wanted to do, but like could do more professionally. So moving to fantasy, because
Mm.
you write fantasy and specifically retellings.
Yes.
Fantasy is such a massive topic. Um, I suppose, I mean, you're doing retellings. Do you have any
Mhm.
other favorite fantasy sub genres? And I guess what initially drew you to fantasy itself?
Well, okay, so I like anything to do with any kind of fantasy basically is I love the creative aspect of it and the inventiveness of it. Like the fact that you can have entire worlds and universes that are completely unique and they're that like they might have original rules like created for specifically for them and they operate by the set of rules but it's like you could start from square one and you could make up the rules that apply to this world and stuff. And so that's what really drew me to it. It was the fact that I could make up the rules of my story. It didn't have to follow any kind of scientific fact. I could just magic things and stuff and play around with that. And like if I needed some specific like object or spell to do something specific, I could create that and I could explain it and I could work it into the story, but it could serve my own purposes kind of a thing. So
complete kind of creative freedom, I suppose.
Yes, I love that.
It's yeah, I love fantasy. It's so amazing. And so I guess what kind of digging a little bit deeper into that, what inspired you to do this retelling series in particular that you're working on now?
So it started with just the Little Mermaid retelling, Princess of Undersea, which actually started as a fan fiction for the show Once Upon a Time.
Oh,
Because, yes, speaking of fantasy fairy tale retellings,
so good.
I loved it for like a season and a half. And then it started just turning into like Real Housewives of Disney, and I wasn't so interested in that.
Total
And
side note, I think it's because they stopped killing people. People died in the first season and a half of that show. Like, and then
yeah,
they just it went a little bit, like you said, Disney
yeah.
Real Housewives or something like that.
And it's just like the romantic entanglements and
Yeah.
stuff just mess the whole up. It's like where's the happily ever after? That's the whole point of fairy tales, right? But yeah, so it started as that, and it was like I had written I had put my own spin on the story of the Little Mermaid for the purposes of this fan fiction, just kind of trying to think of like the way that they kind of respun fairy tales, because I really really like that.
Hmm.
And then it was going to be part of an anthology. I was going to submit it to an anthology of fairy tale retellings because, hey, I already have it halfway done because I wrote this fan fiction.
Hmm.
So then that ended up not submitting it, but then releasing it as a standalone novella. Like it wasn't going to be a series. And so I released it as a standalone novella, my first publication like 4 years ago. So back in like late 2016. And then it was only this year that I was like, wait a minute, I have this story and I have these locations, these settings that I've created for this story, but there's more to tell. There's more characters. It's kind of unfolding, and I want to go deeper and I want to go farther and I want to see these characters and I want to see how many different fairy tales I could bring into them. So then that's why I chose those four, and I was like, I have all the locations, I have all the I kind of know where I'm going with this and stuff, and so that kind of turned into developing a series, the Undersea Saga. So
That's awesome. What a cool way to kick that off. I love fan fiction and I also love Once Upon a Time. So
there
that
you
is
go.
awesome. So when I mean, I suppose that's a really interesting way to kick off writing a novel, I guess, because I had a question for you about like where do you normally start when starting a fantasy story, but like that in particular seems fairly unique in terms of like kicking things off. So I'm going to ask, like, I suppose more orient that question more craft wise. When you are approaching writing a fantasy story, like where is it you start in terms of building it? Is it the world? Is it the characters? Is it the relationships or the plot? For example, I feel like everybody who writes fantasy has a different preference. And what's the first thing that comes to you, I suppose?
Usually it's a particular moment. It's usually especially something to do with either the climax or the inciting moment, kind of a thing. What the part that of the story that kind of kicks everything off is usually like the first idea that kind of comes to my head. And then especially when reading original fantasy as opposed to like fairy tale retellings, fairy tales, of course I'm going to start with the original fairy tale and just kind of try to
Mm-hmm.
twist it and tweak it and stuff. But as far as original fantasy, those stories that I've written, it's like there's a moment where it's like the moment in the story where like everything changes. Then I have to figure out, okay, so wait a minute, what characters do I have in here? Okay, so how did they get there? And like what preceded this scene that I've thought of, that I've come up with, and where are they going next, kind of a thing. And so then in that way I kind of unpack the story from both sides, in both directions,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes and then I have, okay, so this is the beginning. This is where it all started, and this is where it's going to end up, kind of a thing.
That's super interesting. I find like that's super interesting. I've spoken to quite a few people who write fantasy, and a lot of the times it's like people will say, "Oh, I see the world first, or I see a particular character first." But for you, it sounds like it's like a plot point in the climax.
Yeah.
Like you see an event,
The
and
whole
then you
scene.
build it. Like, yeah, the whole
Hey,
scene.
what are you doing here?
No, that's awesome, and I feel like that's really cool. That's really interesting, and like quite a contrast to other people's methods, and it just shows how people can start in different places and end result is a book. So that's really cool. One of the big parts of fantasy writing is obviously world building. So moving on kind of from that plot piece, how do you approach world building, and specifically like within a fairy tale retelling? Because it must be quite intricate. You're playing with a different world, but have to make it your own. And I'm not sure. So anyway, I'm curious, how do you go about world building, especially within your retellings?
Well, the worlds in my fantasy stories end up being largely incidental unless I need to like have a specific location for a specific purpose and stuff. And so it's like that's almost the last thing that I'll get worried about the characters and the plot and stuff, and then it's like, but wait, they're just moving around in a white space. I need some setting here. I need to describe like where they're at, and have those props and have that scene or scenery, so that readers can get a sense of place and belonging and stuff like that. And as far as the Undersea Saga, of course, full disclosure, the place names were inserted into my fan fiction as placeholders. Like the Mermaid Kingdom is under the sea, so I called it Undersea. And then they have the Human Kingdom, which is on a cliff over the water, so they called it Overcliff. And then the kingdom that is across the way is called Crossway, and stuff like that. They were all placeholders, but like I never went back and changed them, and it worked. And I've actually had people come up and be like, it was just that's such a magical name for a place, and it just seems fairly plain, but you read it and it just fits the universe and fits what's going on. And I'm like, okay, I did it on purpose then.
That's so great. That's so great. And I love like how you describe readers saying, it fits perfectly. And it's because you described what it was. So it like fits perfectly.
Very on the nose.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so awesome. And just goes to show, like, I put placeholders in for everything. Maybe I'm just going to start leaving them now. So that's super interesting, though, that it seems to be like characters and such that characters and plot, and that's the focus first, and then building out that kind of larger world. For you, I suppose, like, what's the toughest part of writing fantasy? It is such a massive genre, right? And I feel like for some folks, it can feel very intimidating. So I'm curious to hear from a fantasy writer what you find toughest about it.
I'd probably say the toughest part is like passage of time, timeline, keeping your events straight, because it's one thing to just, write the fan fiction where you can just like show the big events and kind of jump through the plot from event to event that way. But then when you're actually writing a novel, writing a story, you actually have to have a linear, and it has to flow. The parts have to flow together. It's like the transitions from one part to the next. Sometimes like it would take me forever just to come up with like, okay, so I have them right here and they need to be over here, but how do I get through that middle part without being too wordy? Because I tend to be very wordy with things, with my descriptions and everything, and I need to succinctly get them from one place to the next, but with giving the reader enough information to kind of show the passage of time. And yeah, I would say that's the biggest challenge for me.
I feel you on that. That's my literal whole book too. I had like book 1 planned and I'm like, they're here. I have book 3 planned and I'm like, they need to be here. And book 2 is like, well, how the heck do I get them there without it being a boring middle part?
Right? Yes, you don't want to wander too much.
No, 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 no. But yes, I totally get that. The passage of time. That's a great way to put it as well. Would you have any, I suppose, like for anybody writing fantasy or maybe even specifically a retelling, would you have any tips? Could be big, could be small, or anything that's helped you in particular when going about writing fantasy?
I would say that the two biggest things that just helped me with my writing is first of all, I read prolifically. I mean, you can see my bookshelf behind me. It's full of books and all kinds of books. And I read a lot. I read very broadly. I find what I like about different stories. And, sometimes I'll like a bunch of books from one author and then I won't like some other books that they've written, kind of a thing. And or sometimes I find authors where I like literally everything they write because it's just so amazing. And I want to emulate that style in my writing, kind of a thing. And because I read so broadly, then when I go to write, it's like I'm taking little bits from so many different sources that it's like I don't sound like one author or another, but a kind of a mix that's reminiscent of kind of everybody that I've read. So that's the first thing I do. The second thing is just keep writing. It's like your first draft is going to be crap. It's going to get tough. There are going to be plot holes that do not make sense, and it doesn't look like there's any kind of resolution. And you might get to a point where like the whole story is falling apart and you don't know where it's supposed to go. But just keep writing, keep revising, keep going back over it. And you can rewrite something like 3 or 4 times. And finally, like on that fifth draft, suddenly it all starts making sense and it all starts coming together and you feel powerful and and everything. So first of all, read broadly and write fearlessly.
I love that. Read broadly, write fearlessly. That's great. You should trademark that and put it on like t-shirts or something. You should.
Maybe somebody else
has. I've only got a couple questions left and I do see some popping up in the chat. So I just want to take this opportunity to remind everybody that if you do have questions for Leslie, to please go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. My next question is a little bit about your current writing. So, I mean, you got to it a little bit at the beginning in terms of the fairy tale retelling series, which is amazing. I was wondering if you wanted to take any time to tell us about your writing, what you're working on. Do you have any other projects on the back burner? Any like inside track we can get into what you're currently working on?
Absolutely. I always have multiple projects going on because if I focus on one project for too long, it kind of stagnates and I don't want that to happen. So having multiple projects to kind of keep my creative energy flowing and just keep it going, keep it fresh is really helpful for me. So first of all, I have the sequel to Princes of Undersea, which is called Fugitive of Crossway. So it's there's a character, a young boy he's a farm boy from Overcliff, and he is in a boating accident and he washes up on the beach in Crossway and is picked up by a traveling carnival, and which they happen to have a mermaid as a sideshow. It's one of their sideshows. And so things happen, no spoilers, but the mermaid ends up transforming into a human, and they both want to escape, and the boy wants to get back to Overcliff, the mermaid wants to get back to the water, and they both have to do this while the carnival is the ringmaster wants to get his sideshow back and stuff, so he's on their tail, and they have to get back to the coast and stuff, and they have to find their way there, and it kind of brings in the story of Pinocchio and the different characters that he encounters in Fugitive of Crossway are kind of callbacks and references to that story. I kind of went through our copy of Pinocchio and kind of marked and like, oh, I could do this and I could do this and everything all the way through. So I have that I'm working on. I also have, if you want to read like things that I'm actively writing, as I finish them, I have a blog, The Upstream Writer, that you can where you can read a serial series that I'm actively writing called The Clan of Outcasts. And so I have that. It's a kind of a fantasy punk series because there's like fantasy, it's medievalish, but I've also brought in like some cyberpunk tech into their kind of a thing. And so it's the series about this group of people, this kingdom, fantasy kingdom, where some of the people have like superpowers. And so then they're outcasts, but then they have to sneak back into the kingdom and put the rightful heir on the throne and try to avoid the current government that's trying to take them out and everything. And so so there's that, and I have so I started it a couple years ago, and then I'm writing what's now the third season that I'm working on now, and so it's a whole new plot arc, a whole new story with some of the same characters and with new characters. So that's been really fun.
That's awesome. And for everybody who's watching, I've put the blog in the chat there, so everybody can go ahead. It's also linked down in the description box below, so please go ahead and click on that. Leslie, I have one last question for you, and this is a question that I, again, ask everybody that comes on the IndieVerse. If you could give yourself one piece of advice before publishing your first book, what would it be and why?
Okay, advice that I wish I'd had before publishing. Well, one of the things is have people in place, to have an idea in place to where you're going to market and stuff. And that was something that I didn't do the first time I published, like 4 or 5 years ago. And it kind of showed, because it was hard to let people know about it, to have people, hear about my book, kind of get the word out and everything. This time around, I actually had an idea in place before I went ahead and self-published it and rebooted it and updated it and everything. And it's been a lot more, I've had a lot more opportunity to talk about it and share about it. And I feel like that has really, really helped. So having a marketing plan in place, basically, like marketing is the hardest thing to do after publishing. I mean, compared to marketing, the publishing process was actually pretty easy. So that would be
true.
That would be a big piece of advice that I think I very much benefited from this second time around.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. And yes, that is definitely self-publishing and marketing. Those two things go hand in hand. So I see a couple questions come in through the chat. If you have any more, please drop them in there, but we're going to dive right into those. Leslie, I mean, before I even get into those, thank you so much for answering all of my questions. We do have a question coming in from Heather. How did you select the fairy tales you wanted to use?
I started with Little Mermaid because I had that fairy tale, and it's one of my favorite fairy tales. And then Pinocchio because I had this male main character, and I was like, okay, out of all of the male fronted fairy tales, like which one would kind of fit the kind of story that I wanted to use? And then it was kind of interesting because I'd already had the idea in the course of doing my other kind of retellings that were kind of one-offs kind of a thing. I had seen a picture or something, some artwork that kind of gave me the idea of doing like a steampunk Aladdin. So I'd already started thinking in that direction. And then it was just a matter of like, okay, how can I take this steampunk Aladdin idea and also use locations and characters that I already have in my series? I had a kind of a Wild Western kind of a character, and I had a location that I called Out West. In as a location, I kind of mention it in Fugitive of Crossway because there's a character from Out West in that series and stuff in that book. And so then it kind of turned more from steampunk to kind of more Wild West kind of a thing. And then and then for the last one, I knew I wanted to do something involving royalty, and Snow White is a popular fairy tale to retell, but I hadn't seen it done with mermaids before. So I was like, is there a way that I can throw kind of mermaids into the Snow White story, kind of retell the story with mermaids? And I figured it out, and I think it's going to work, and it's going to be so much fun.
That's so awesome. And for like, just as you're going through those and you're saying steampunk Aladdin, like that just, I mean, the lamp and the magic carpet, like that just, it feels steampunk to me. Like even, you don't think of it, but now that you say it, I'm like, yeah, it totally is. So Heather does have another question, but I'm going to skip down to McGill's question just because I think those two go together, and then we'll get back to Heather's other question. So McGill was asking, how faithful to the originals are you in your retellings?
I use the original as kind of my basis and launch off from there. So I want to be kind of more true, and especially for like the Little Mermaid story, I actually went to the original fairy tale and was kind of doing the same sort of thing that Once Upon a Time did. It's like throwing in kind of little references or little touches of like the Disney version. Like I totally had the happily ever after ending, which is not the ending that the original fairy tale had at all. So, and readers have been saying that they really did feel a sense of revisiting the original fairy tale through new eyes and from a new perspective, which is kind of what I'm going for. So that's awesome to hear and stuff. So I try to stay as faithful as possible, and where it's not possible, I'll at least make a reference to the original, and you'll really come away with the sense of like being able to understand the original fairy tale a little better.
Very cool. Yeah. I think that's really interesting how you like take, like, you remain faithful, and then where you can't because of a plot change or whatever it might be, there's the little nods to the original, which is very awesome. And so the last question we have here from the audience is from Heather. So Heather is asking, who were the fantasy authors that inspired you to write? So I guess who are the big like authors that I suppose you look up to?
Yes. So one of the first fantasy authors that was probably the biggest inspiration to me just starting out was C.S. Lewis. I devoured the Chronicles of Narnia, like from cover to cover. I even wrote my own spin-off of that series. And so that was my first huge inspiration. And the other, as far as like anytime I wanted to read, I wanted to read as many fairy tale retellings as I could, and hands down the best fairy tale retelling series I have ever read that I love dearly is The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Meyer. I adore that series, and I really loved the way that she did the same thing as well. As she included references to the original fairy tale, and you could totally feel like you are reading that original tale, but at the same time it's her own plot, and it's very much crossing over and back and forth and mashing up. So there's Marissa Meyer. Cornelia Funke is another one that I read a lot of, like the Inkheart trilogy and the Mirror World trilogy. I mean, just the way that she described things, it was just so vivid, and so her words are so beautiful that I really, really love her style. And then Naomi Novik is another one who has a really, really amazing, profound style that I really, really enjoy in her books Uprooted and Spinning Silver. I mean, they're completely original fairy tales, but the way that they harken back to the folklore that she's drawing from, it feels like another folk story, reading another folk story. So those are authors that I highly recommend.
That's amazing. And Inkheart, my like nostalgia, that book. All right, well, I think that's it from the questions from the chat. Leslie, thank you so much for coming on to the IndieVerse. It was so lovely to chat with you and learn about the books you're writing, and also learn a little bit more about like fantasy and your approach to it, and fairy tale retellings as well. Everyone's saying thank you in the chat, and thank you to all of the lovely viewers who came and joined us today and asked questions, and were just here listening. That was really wonderful. So the IndieVerse happens every Tuesday night at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So if everybody's interested, you can come back here next week and we'll have another chat. But before we go, Leslie, I'm going to turn it over to you to leave us with anything you want to leave us with, promote whatever you want to promote. And just so everybody knows, Leslie's author page and blog are linked down in the description box below. So please go follow and like and do all of those wonderful things. So Leslie, I'll turn it over to you. Which way are you? This way.
Thank you, Kayla. Yeah, I love books so much that I will take any opportunity to talk about books and talk about my favorite books and give book recommendations. So if you do come by my Facebook author page, where I'm kind of the most active, or on my blog, if you're reading those stories and you really just want to comment and let me know what's going on or what you're thinking while you're reading, I absolutely love it. I will probably respond, and and I look forward to, if you do decide to get my book, it's available on Amazon, and I think the paperback is Amazon has discounted the paperback to under $10 right now, so which is a really good price for a paperback. So yes. It's recommended by everyone who's read it so far. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what everybody thinks of the rest of the series. And
I'm dropping your Amazon in the chat right now. All right. Awesome. So there's the link, everybody. If you need it, this will take you to Leslie's Amazon author page. So be sure to go check out blog, Facebook, and go get Leslie's books and follow along for the journey of the retelling series, because that's very exciting. Anyway, Leslie, it was such a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much again to everybody who came to watch, and we'll catch everybody next week. Bye.
bye.